during the, it's based on the Mahabharata, and he writes, and I'm quoting, "Children of the forest who had lived there happily for generations since time began, they've gone without a trace. With their language that sounded like the burbling of a brook, their songs that sounded like the twittering of birds, and the secrets of their shamans who could cure any sickness by casting spells with their special flutes, made from the hollow wing bones of red-crested cranes. Why did they do it? Who knows? Just for kicks, maybe. Maybe the fact that they now had all these fantastic weapons went to their heads, and they just couldn't wait to test their awesome powers. Maybe they just wanted a clear title to the land, unchallenged by so much as a tiger moth." When we look at the militarization in Adivasi areas and other parts of the country, we constantly ask ourselves, why do they do it? To test their weapons? To clear the land? Maybe just because they can. And the way that people treat Adivasis is also just because that's the way they can. If you think about the state's definition of tribals in this country, the 1965 local committee said, 1956, that it was based on shyness, isolation, but all of those factors don't really make any sense when you're looking at Adivasi populations today. What really unites the 8.6% of the country today that is classified as scheduled tribes is the fact that they suffer from exceptional poverty, exceptional discrimination, which is not really applicable except today perhaps to Muslims, who are also now among the poorest populations, competing with the SCs and Dalits, SCs and STs. But the third factor which really distinguishes the Adivasis from any other population in the country is militarization. Because if you look at all the places where Adivasis have been living and protesting, these are the places where the state has employed the maximum militarization. In Kashmir, of course, but northeast, central India. If you look at the places where the government has used bombs against its own people, it is only in the tribal areas, whether it is Nagaland, Mizoram or Chhattisgarh. It's only here where the government has actually bombed its own people, and these are all Adivasi populations. Actually, across the world, academics who have been looking at whether there is any meaning to the word tribe have described it as a formation where people who refuse to be controlled by a hierarchical state and have resisted are then characterized as tribes and have maintained a degree of unity, of equality and resistance to centralized authority. So the definition of tribes that we should use today is people who are resisting a hierarchical authority and who have suffered militarization as a consequence of that resistance. If you think about the first incident of firing in independent India was 1st January 1948, during when people in Jharkhand were protesting, asking for Kharsawan to be integrated into the then province of Jharkhand that they were fighting for. And this was even while the Constituent Assembly was holding its sessions, while the Constitution was being written. And Jaipal Singh Munda, Adivasi leader in the Constituent Assembly, wrote a pamphlet on this occasion saying, "This is the first Jallianwala Bagh of independent India, and it has fallen to Odia police rather than the British to be the first butchers in independent India." But we have seen then that there have been so many massacres of Adivasis whenever they protest. Kranti sir mentioned Indra Valley, and of course it's a very well-known phenomena in Andhra, Telangana. And at that time, anthropologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorff talked about how this was such a blot on the Indian state and it would take a long time for people to recover from this democratic assault. Von Führer-Heimendorff was not a member of CLC, he was not an Naxalite, he was not a member of HRF, but he could see that this was such an injustice being done to Adivasi people. If you think about the people who have been displaced, between Walter Fernandez had figures of people displaced. Between 1947 and 2000, he estimated that 60 million people were displaced, of which 40% were Adivasis, which meant that 1 in 4 have been displaced. Subsequently, if you look at figures by the International Displacement Monitoring Center, of course there is no data on the kind of displacement in India, and we don't know how many people have been displaced under different categories, but according to them, there were 1.8 million displacements between 2008 and 2022 due to conflict and violence, including home demolitions. Now, under the bulldozer Raj, the most visible face of home demolitions is, of course, Muslim homes, Muslim shops, Muslim places of worship. But Adivasi places of worship, Adivasi homes, Adivasi resources have always suffered, not bulldozer necessarily demolition, but large JCB demolitions as people have been mining these areas or taking them over for forests or for large dams. Normally when we talk about displacement, people think about displacement due to large development projects, whether large dams